I realized I was being erased the moment my daughter-in-law smiled at me and raised her glass. I am Margaret Collins, and until that afternoon, I believed that love earned through decades of sacrifice could not simply be dismissed with a laugh and a toast. When my phone rang 2 weeks earlier and Daniel told me they were hosting a birthday lunch for my grandson Ethan, I hesitated before saying yes, not because I didn't adore that boy, but because I had learned to listen to the quiet warnings that come when you've lived long enough to see patterns repeat themselves. Still, I pressed my good dress, wrapped a gift with care, and drove the 20 miles to the restaurant, telling myself that family is family and that a grandmother belongs at her grandson's table. The place was a polished American bistro, all light wood and clinking glasses, the kind of restaurant where lunches stretch into long conversations and everyone pretends nothing is wrong. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do, and waited by the host's stand while younger couples brushed past me without noticing. When we were seated, I saw immediately that my name card was placed at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen doors, while Emily sat beside Daniel in the center, laughing easily, already holding court. I told myself it didn't matter, that at 68 you should be grateful just to be invited, but a small part of me remembered when I used to sit at the head of tables, when this family revolved around my kitchen and my patience. Throughout the meal, conversations floated over me like background noise. They discussed vacation plans I wasn't included in, decisions already made without my input, stories I had heard secondhand. Ethan was happy, opening gifts, his face smeared with chocolate frosting, and I focused on him because loving him was simple and safe. Emily barely looked my way except to offer polite nods that felt practiced, like lines rehearsed in advance. I noticed how Daniel avoided my eyes, how his shoulders tightened whenever Emily spoke a little louder, and I wondered when my son had learned to be silent in his own family. As plates were cleared and dessert menus arrived, Emily stood up, tapping her glass lightly with a spoon, the sound sharp enough to cut through the room. People smiled, expecting a warm birthday toast, and I felt that familiar instinct to straighten my back, to be gracious, to show appreciation for whatever kindness was about to be offered. She began by thanking everyone for coming, praising Ethan, praising Daniel, praising the life they were building, and then her gaze landed on me, lingering just long enough to make my stomach tighten. Her smile didn't waver, but something behind it hardened, and I understood too late that this moment was not meant to honor me. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, aware of my age in a way I hadn't been before, aware of how easy it is to turn an older woman into a joke if you dress it up as humor. Around us, forks paused midair, conversations stopped, and every instinct I had told me to stay calm, to observe, to remember every word. In that instant, I thought about the years I spent raising Daniel alone after his father passed, the long shifts I worked, the birthdays I organized, the help I offered freely once Emily entered our lives, believing that generosity would be returned in kind. I realized that day that kindness can be mistaken for weakness, and silence for consent. And as Emily continued speaking, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I would not interrupt, I would not defend myself, and I would not forget how it felt to sit at that table and understand, with perfect clarity, that I was no longer seen as family, but as an obstacle they were preparing to move aside. The room seemed to breathe again after Emily lowered her glass, laughter returning in small, uneven bursts, and I felt as though I had just been pushed gently but firmly out of a place I once occupied without question. I forced my lips into a smile because that is what women like me were taught to do, to smooth over discomfort so others do not have to face it, and I nodded as if the words I had just heard were harmless, even generous. Inside, I catalogued every reaction, the way Emily sat down without glancing at me again, satisfied, the way a few relatives exchanged quick looks before returning to their plates, relieved that the moment had passed without open conflict. Daniel reached for his water glass, his hand shaking slightly, and stared down at the table as if the wood grain held answers he was afraid to read. No one asked if I was all right, and that silence told me more than any insult could have. I took a slow sip of my iced tea, counted to 5, and reminded myself that dignity is not something another person can take unless you hand it to them. The rest of the lunch moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened, waiters refilling glasses, Ethan laughing at a joke someone made, Emily leaning toward Daniel and whispering, her voice low and intimate, a partnership I was clearly no longer part of. I watched them the way you watch strangers on a train, with curiosity and a growing sense of distance, wondering when my role had shifted from mother to observer. When the check arrived, Emily waved it away with a practiced gesture, announcing that they had it covered, and I thanked her, even though I recognized the unspoken message that came with it, that I was a guest now, not a contributor. As we stood to leave, Emily hugged everyone else warmly and offered me a brief, careful embrace that barely brushed my shoulders, her perfume sharp and unfamiliar, and said she hoped I enjoyed myself. I told her the lunch was lovely, because honesty would have only made me look difficult, and because I had already decided that my response would come later, quietly, on my own terms. The drive home felt longer than usual, the familiar streets stretching out as if to give me time to think, and I replayed the afternoon again and again, not with anger but with clarity. I thought about the small moments that had led here, the invitations that stopped coming, the advice that was no longer sought, the way Emily corrected me in front of others with a smile that disguised its sharpness. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I understood that this was not a single incident, but the confirmation of a shift that had been underway for years. Inside my house, the silence was thick but comforting, the kind of quiet that belongs to someone who has lived alone long enough to make peace with it. I set my purse down, placed Ethan's empty gift bag by the door, and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I once helped Daniel with his homework and planned family holidays that now belonged to someone else. I did not cry because tears felt like a waste of energy, and I did not call anyone to complain, because I knew how those conversations would end, with polite sympathy and no real change. Instead, I opened the folder I kept in the cabinet above the fridge, the one labeled simply with my name, and began to review the papers inside, documents I had signed years ago without imagining they would one day become relevant in this way. I realized then that while Emily believed she had defined my place with a few well-chosen words, she had underestimated the patience of a woman who has survived loss, raised a child alone, and learned the value of preparation. That afternoon at the restaurant did not break me. It clarified something I had been avoiding, and as the sun set outside my window, I made a promise to myself that I would no longer wait to be included, respected, or remembered. I would decide, quietly and deliberately, what my future looked like. And when the time came, they would understand that the woman they had dismissed at a birthday lunch had been paying attention all along. The following week I received a call from Daniel, his voice tentative, like someone walking carefully through a room full of fragile things. I had been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. He asked if I would come over to his house for a talk. I knew the conversation would not be easy, and I didn't want to go. But I agreed anyway because that's what mothers do, don't they? They keep showing up, even when their place at the table is no longer guaranteed. When I arrived at their house, Emily greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I could tell she had been rehearsing what to say. Daniel, on the other hand, looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other like he wasn't sure where to stand. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened at the lunch," he said, his voice tight like he was bracing for an explosion. I nodded and sat down in the living room, where everything felt too quiet, too formal. They had moved some of the furniture around, and it struck me how every inch of their house had been arranged to reflect a life that didn't include me. A life I no longer seemed to fit into. I waited for Emily to speak, but she was silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry about what happened at the lunch," Daniel said after a long pause, his eyes avoiding mine. "I know it wasn't right. But you have to understand, Emily didn't mean it like that. She's been under a lot of pressure." I looked at him, surprised by the feeble excuse. He was offering me an apology without actually taking responsibility for the actions that had hurt me. The words sounded hollow, like a rehearsed line that he thought would make everything better. I wanted to tell him that I didn't need his excuses, that I didn't need anyone to defend Emily's behavior. I wanted to say that I had seen enough to understand what was really happening. But instead I held my tongue and waited. "Emily just feels like she's been trying so hard to make things work with you. And sometimes it's hard to know how to balance everything," he continued, his voice growing softer, as though trying to soften the truth. I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or to himself. I looked at Emily, expecting her to jump in and explain herself, but she remained silent, her eyes cast down, avoiding mine. I wondered if she truly believed what Daniel was saying, or if this was just a way for her to justify her behavior to herself. I didn't need to hear any more. I could see it in their faces. They had made their decision, and it wasn't going to change. They had chosen their side, and I was no longer a part of it. The realization settled in like a weight in my chest, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate choice. A choice to push me out of the family, to replace me with something younger, something more palatable, something that didn't come with the baggage of years of sacrifice, love, and responsibility. I stood up slowly, my hands clenched at my sides. I could feel the anger rising, but I wasn't going to let it show. Not now, not here. I think I understand everything. I need to, I said quietly, my voice calm but firm. I'm sorry that you both feel that way, but I won't apologize for the years I've spent raising my son, or for the love I have for my family. There was a pause, a moment of uncomfortable silence, before I turned and walked out of the room, not waiting for them to say anything more. As I left their house, I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. I had given everything to this family, and now I was the one who had to let go. I had to accept that my place in their lives was no longer guaranteed, that the role I had played for so long was no longer needed. But I was still me. I still had my dignity, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. As I drove home, I realized that I had reached a turning point. This wasn't just about Emily's words or the way they had treated me. It was about something deeper, something I had been avoiding for far too long. It was about reclaiming my own life, my own identity, and not letting anyone else define it for me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to keep playing the role of the invisible woman. The next chapter of my life was waiting for me, and it was time to step into it, with or without their approval. The days that followed felt different, like the world had tilted slightly off its axis, and I was now seeing everything through a new lens. I didn't rush to pick up the phone or send any messages. I let the silence stretch out between us, thinking about how much of my life had been spent trying to patch up things that were never really broken in the first place. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had spent too many years convincing myself that love and loyalty could heal any wound. But love, I discovered, can only go so far when it is not reciprocated. One morning, nearly a week after that conversation, I woke up with a sudden clarity I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just free. I had spent so much of my life being what others wanted me to be. The dutiful wife, the overworked mother, the always there grandmother. But no one had asked me what I wanted, what I needed. And for the first time, I realized that I didn't have to answer to anyone anymore. I didn't owe anyone my time or my energy. The realization settled deep inside me like a calm certainty, and with it came a quiet strength. It wasn't a strength born of defiance, but of acceptance. I accepted that this was no longer my family, not in the way it had been. They had moved on, and now I had to move on too, not because I wanted to, but because it was necessary. I decided to spend the next few weeks focusing on things that brought me peace. I started taking long walks in the mornings, something I hadn't done in years. I rediscovered my love for gardening, spending hours in the backyard planting flowers that would bloom in the spring. And I began to spend more time with friends who had been pushed aside for far too long, while I'd been focused on my son and his family. It felt good to be seen again, to be valued by people who didn't measure my worth by what I could give them. One afternoon, while I was tending to my garden, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Daniel. I knew the handwriting immediately. It was a simple folded piece of paper, and as I opened it, I could feel my heart tighten in anticipation. The letter began with an apology. He said he was sorry for not seeing what had been happening, for allowing things to spiral out of control, and for failing to understand my perspective. He wrote that he had spoken to Emily, and they had discussed what had happened at the birthday lunch. I read through his words and I could feel the sincerity in them, but something about it didn't sit right. He apologized, but the apology felt like an afterthought, a way to fix something that couldn't be fixed with just a few words. I set the letter down on the table, staring at it for a long time. I didn't know what to do with it. On one hand, it was exactly what I had wanted to hear from him, but on the other hand, it was too little, too late. I had already made my peace. I had already moved on from the role I had once played in their lives. The idea of forgiveness had always been complicated for me. I knew that holding on to resentment would only poison me. But I also knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer where I kept the rest of my memories, not because I didn't care, but because I had finally learned that some things are better left in the past. As the weeks passed, the feeling of freedom grew stronger. I wasn't bound by guilt or obligation anymore. I was finally living for myself, and it felt like the air had cleared. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, I realized something important. I hadn't just forgiven them, I had forgiven myself. I had stopped asking for validation from people who didn't truly see me, and in doing so, I had found a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I didn't need their approval, their understanding, or their love. What I needed was to respect myself, to live a life that was mine and mine alone. And as I sat there watching the sun dip below the horizon, I understood that this was the beginning of something new. I wasn't going to spend my time chasing after relationships that no longer served me. I wasn't going to apologize for taking up space in this world. I was Margaret Collins, and for the first time in a long time I was ready to live on my own terms. It had been 2 months since I last heard from Daniel or Emily. The silence wasn't a punishment. It was a result of my choice to stop waiting for things to get better. I had made peace with the fact that sometimes people move on, and sometimes the roles you once played in their lives are no longer needed. And that was okay. But even though I had let go, the quiet moments still felt heavy, like a lingering weight on my chest. I tried to distract myself. There were days I buried myself in gardening, feeling the earth between my fingers, the quiet hum of life all around me. I spent weekends at the local farmers market, talking to vendors and buying fresh produce, reminding myself that there was still a world outside of my family, one where I was seen and appreciated. Still, there were nights when the quiet seemed too loud. Nights when I'd sit alone in my living room, a cup of tea in my hands, and wonder if Daniel ever thought of me, if Emily ever regretted the way she treated me. But I didn't let those thoughts consume me. Not anymore. Life had moved forward, and so had I. Then one evening, as I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset, I saw a figure in the distance walking up my driveway. At first I thought it was a neighbor, but as the person drew closer, I recognized the shape of Daniel. My heart tightened, and I stood up before I could even think about it. I hadn't expected him to come. I hadn't expected anyone to come, not after everything that had happened. But here he was standing at my door, looking as nervous as he had the last time I saw him. "Mom," he said quietly, almost hesitant, as if waiting for permission to speak. I nodded, stepping back to let him in. I didn't know what he wanted, but part of me had missed him. Despite everything, he was still my son. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had spent so many years cooking, teaching, listening. He was still the same person, and yet, in some way he was also different, older, quieter, more distant. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching for something in mine, as if trying to read my thoughts. "I've been thinking about everything," he said finally, his voice low. "About what happened. And I know I wasn't there for you, Mom. I know I should have done more, said more. But I wasn't ready. I didn't want to face what was happening, and I didn't want to lose what I had with Emily. I didn't realize what I was losing in the process." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a mixture of relief and sorrow. He was apologizing finally, but the words felt like they were coming too late, like they couldn't undo the damage that had been done. I had already accepted that he might never fully understand what I had been through, what I had sacrificed for him. But hearing him say it, hearing him finally admit that he had failed me, was both painful and healing at the same time. "I understand," I said softly, my voice steady. "I understand more than you think." He sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if the weight of his confession had lifted a little. "I just want to make things right," he said, looking at me with a sincerity that made my heart ache. "I know I can't fix everything, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in months I saw the son I had raised, the one who had once looked at me with admiration and love. It was the same son, but he was a little older, a little wiser. He wasn't perfect and I wasn't perfect, but maybe, just maybe, there was room for us to rebuild something. "I don't know what that looks like yet," I said carefully, my hands wrapped around my cup of tea. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to have a relationship with you again, but it's going to be different. It has to be different." He nodded, his eyes bright with something like hope. I could see that he wasn't expecting everything to go back to the way it was before, and that was the first real sign of maturity I had seen from him in years. "I get it," he said, "and I'll do whatever it takes. I promise." As I sat there talking with my son, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't just about accepting someone else's apology. It was about accepting my own worth, about knowing that I had the right to set boundaries and take care of myself. I had spent so many years giving everything I had to everyone else, and now I was learning to put myself first. It wasn't about holding on to bitterness or resentment. It was about creating space for something new, something healthier. We talked for hours that evening about the past, about the future, about everything that had gone wrong and everything that could still go right. And when Daniel finally left, I didn't feel the emptiness I had expected. I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Maybe things wouldn't ever be the same, but they didn't have to be. All I could do was take things one step at a time, and for the first time in a long time I was ready to do just that. The days after Daniel's visit felt like stepping into a new chapter, one where I no longer felt defined by what had happened, but instead by what I was choosing to do now. I didn't expect miracles, but the conversation had lifted something in me, a kind of quiet relief that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for us to rebuild what we had lost. I wasn't under any illusion that things would ever be the same as they were before Emily's toasts and the quiet betrayals, but I had finally come to terms with the fact that I couldn't force anyone to change. What I could control was how I responded, how I chose to live my life moving forward. As I continued to rebuild, I spent more time with friends, people who had seen me not as a mother or a grandmother but simply as Margaret. Their company was a reminder that I had value outside of my family role, that I was more than the sum of my past sacrifices. I learned to enjoy small pleasures again. I took long walks in the early morning, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, and when I returned I spent time in my garden, watching my flowers bloom, a silent testament to the care and attention I had put into them. It was in those moments of solitude that I found a sense of peace, one I hadn't known in years. The house, once so full of noise and children's laughter, now felt empty in a different way. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that came from loss, it was the kind of emptiness that was open to possibility. For the first time in a long time I felt like I had space to breathe. One evening, about a month after Daniel's visit, I received another call. This time it was from Emily. My heart skipped a beat before I picked up the phone. I had no idea what to expect. The last time I saw her, I had felt so much distance between us, so much unresolved tension. But her voice, when it came through the receiver, was softer than I remembered. "Margaret," she said, her tone cautious but not cold. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything, really." I waited, not sure what she was going to say. "I want to apologize. I realize now that I wasn't fair to you. I didn't take into account how much you've done for this family, how much you've sacrificed. And I'm sorry." The words, though simple, were heavier than anything I had heard from her before. I didn't say anything at first. I needed a moment to process, to understand if this apology was genuine, or just a way for her to clear her conscience. "I know I can't undo the past," she continued, "but I want to try to make things right if you're willing to let me." There it was. The invitation I hadn't expected, yet somehow had always hoped for. She wanted to try. I hadn't anticipated this. I hadn't known how to respond because part of me still felt wary. I wasn't sure if I could trust her, if I could allow her back into my life so easily. But another part of me, the part that had once welcomed her into my family, the part that still remembered the woman she had been before the bitterness had crept in, felt something else. "Hope." "Emily," I said, my voice steady but cautious, "I appreciate your apology. I really do. And I think we can move forward. But it's going to take time. I need time." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," she said quietly, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. "I'll give you as much time as you need. I just want to show you that I'm serious about this." It wasn't much, but it was something. A glimmer of possibility. I didn't know where this new path would take us, but I knew it was worth exploring. The next few weeks were slow, careful steps. We didn't rush to fix everything. Instead, we took small, tentative actions like meeting for coffee, talking about neutral things at first, anything that wasn't tied to the past. And slowly, in small moments, I began to see a change in Emily. She wasn't perfect and I wasn't asking her to be. But she was trying and that effort mattered. Felt strange after everything to start rebuilding a relationship with her. But I realized that I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing it for me because I had learned to stop clinging to the pain of the past. I wasn't going to let it define me anymore. I was in control of my own story now. And as I sat in that coffee shop with Emily, watching her sip her drink and laugh awkwardly, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was room for us to move forward. Not to erase what had happened but to create something new, something different. A relationship based on honesty, boundaries, and respect. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. I hadn't seen Emily in a few weeks after that coffee meeting, but I could tell she was making an effort. We exchanged text messages, small check-ins about the weather, about the news, about nothing in particular. It was strange at first, trying to figure out where to place this new version of our relationship. It wasn't the same and it wasn't meant to be. We were both learning how to navigate a new dynamic, one where we weren't playing the roles we had before. Mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. There were no expectations to be met, no need for pretense. It was simply two women, both with their own pasts, trying to find common ground. I'd be lying if I said it was easy. It wasn't. I still felt the ghost of past interactions lingering in the back of my mind. But every time Emily reached out, every time she made an effort to connect, it chipped away at the wall I had built around myself. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel called. "Mom, we're having a family dinner this weekend. Just a small one, but I'd love for you to come." I could hear the nervousness in his voice, the anticipation of what might happen. It had been months since we had shared a meal together as a family, and I wasn't sure what to expect. I hadn't agreed to anything yet when I called Emily to ask how she felt about it. "We're just trying to make things work, Margaret," she said quietly. "I don't want you to feel pressured, but we'd really love for you to be there." Her voice wasn't defensive but soft, sincere. It felt different than the sharp edges I had once felt when she spoke to me. I told her I'd think about it. That night, as I sat in my living room, I realized something important. This wasn't just about the dinner. It wasn't even just about Emily or Daniel. It was about me. This was my decision. I had the power to choose whether or not I wanted to walk into that room, whether or not I was ready to take that step. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for myself because I was ready to see where this new path could lead. The next evening, I put on a simple dress, something comfortable but nice, and I drove to Daniel's house. The closer I got, the more my heart seemed to beat in my throat. I wasn't sure what I was walking into, but I knew it would be a moment that defined where we went from here. I rang the doorbell and Emily answered. She looked nervous too, but when she saw me standing there, she smiled. Not the forced smile from before, but a real one, and I felt a small flicker of hope that maybe this time things could be different. "Hi, Margaret," she said, her voice warm, inviting. "We're glad you came." She led me inside and the house was quiet, the atmosphere soft and open. Daniel was in the kitchen, his back turned as he stirred something on the stove. When he saw me, he straightened up and for a moment, there was an awkward silence between us, but it wasn't heavy. It was like we were both waiting for the other person to make the first move to break the tension. Finally, he stepped forward. "I'm glad you're here, Mom," he said, his voice sincere. I nodded, not sure what to say. We all sat down at the table, and the conversation started slowly, but it wasn't as strained as I had feared. It was easy, almost comfortable, as we talked about everything from what had been going on in the world to what Ethan was up to. The small talk seemed to carry us through the evening, but underneath it all I could feel the change. Emily was different. She was careful with her words, yes, but she was trying. And that effort was enough for me. By the time dinner was finished, I wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but it had. I had allowed myself to let go of the past, even if only for one evening, and it had made all the difference. When it was time to leave, I hugged both of them. It wasn't a long embrace, but it was real. Felt like a bridge had been built one step at a time. I didn't know where this new relationship would take us, but I knew I had done something important that night. I had shown up. I had taken the first step toward healing. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. I walked out of their house that evening with a sense of calm I hadn't expected. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning. A new beginning, one that was mine to shape. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. I had been waiting for the call, but when it came I wasn't sure how to feel. It had been months since that awkward dinner, since the tentative steps we had taken toward rebuilding something that had once been so broken. I had kept my distance, choosing to let things unfold naturally, but a part of me still wondered if it was too late, if the cracks in our relationship had run too deep to ever be fully repaired. This time it was Daniel. He asked if we could meet at a cafe somewhere neutral. I agreed, though I couldn't help but feel the familiar knot in my stomach as I got ready to go. When I walked into the cafe, I saw Daniel sitting by the window, looking the same as he always did, tall, broad-shouldered, with his hands folded in front of him as he stared out at the street. He looked up when he saw me, and for a moment we both just stared at each other, not sure how to begin. Finally he stood and gave me a small smile. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Thanks for coming." I nodded and sat across from him, feeling a little out of place. I hadn't realized how much time had passed since we'd had a conversation like this, just the two of us, without any of the usual family tension hanging in the air. "I've been thinking a lot," he continued, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "About everything. About the way things used to be, and how I took it all for granted." I waited, not sure where this was going. He wasn't looking at me now. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the cup of coffee in front of him, his voice low. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. For not being there when you needed me. For letting things get so bad." His apology wasn't the first one I'd received, but something about the way he said it felt different. There was no hint of defensiveness, no excuses, just pure remorse. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a step toward healing. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, "I appreciate that. I do. But we can't keep going back to the past. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." I paused, letting my words sink in. "You're right. Things went wrong and we both have to face that. But that doesn't mean we can't start over. It doesn't mean we can't build something new." I could see the relief in his eyes, the weight lifting from his shoulders as he finally looked up at me. "I want that too," he said, his voice earnest. "I want to make things right, and I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to try. I don't want to lose you again." There was a long silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had been unsaid. For the first time in months I felt like we were on the same page, like we were both ready to move forward. We didn't talk much after that, just the usual pleasantries about work, about Ethan, about the weather. But I could tell something had shifted. We were no longer two people circling around each other, too afraid to face the truth. We were both willing to try, willing to make the effort, even if it wasn't going to be perfect. As I left the cafe, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a step toward healing. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew that I wasn't the same person I had been before. I had learned to let go, to accept the past, and to look forward to whatever came next. I was no longer waiting for others to change for me, I was changing for myself, and that was enough. I knew that I had the strength to keep moving forward no matter what. I sat at my kitchen table one morning, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun creep over the horizon. It had been nearly 6 months since that conversation with Daniel at the cafe. The weight of the past few years, the mistakes, the hurt, the silent battles all seemed lighter now. Things weren't perfect and they never would be, but they were better. I had learned that healing wasn't linear, that it took time, and that sometimes it wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding peace with what had happened. Emily and I had started seeing each other more frequently. The conversations were still guarded, tentative, but they were real. No longer was there the pretense of politeness or the awkward distance of two people who had once been strangers. Now we were two women, each with our own scars, trying to find common ground in a place that was no longer about competition or power, but about understanding. I wasn't looking for apologies, not anymore. I wasn't even looking for forgiveness, not in the way I once thought I needed it. What I wanted was the freedom to move on, to let go of the resentment that had kept me tied to a version of the past that no longer served me. And that's exactly what I had done. The relationship between Emily and me was still a work in progress, but it was a start, and I wasn't rushing it. The one thing I had learned through all of this was that time heals in its own way. and no one can dictate how quickly that happens. I was finally learning how to accept things for what they were, rather than what I had hoped they would be. A few weeks after that, I received a call from Ethan. He was 14 now, no longer the child I remembered from the birthday lunch, but a young man, still with the same curious eyes, the same infectious smile. "Grandma, I was wondering, could we go to that park you used to take me to when I was little?" I hadn't heard his voice like this in a long time. There was something in his tone that told me he wanted to reconnect, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I agreed, of course. How could I say no? The park had been one of my favorite places to take him when he was young. A place where we'd watch the ducks, play on the swings, and eat ice cream on hot summer days. When we arrived at the park, Ethan looked almost shy, as if unsure of what to say. I didn't push him. I simply sat on the bench watching as he kicked the dirt, looking around, taking it all in. It was in that moment, as I watched him try to find his way back to a part of his childhood that had slipped away, that I realized how much time had passed, and how much I had missed. "I remember this place," Ethan said quietly, sitting beside me on the bench. "It feels different now, but I remember the fun we had." I smiled, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Me too, Ethan. Me too." We didn't need to say anything more. The silence between us was comfortable, and I could feel the years of distance starting to fade away. It wasn't about the words we spoke or the things we had missed. It was about the shared memory, the shared understanding that we were both willing to meet each other halfway. I knew then that this was the start of something new, something that could grow slowly like the flowers in my garden. It wasn't about rushing or forcing things to be what they weren't. It was about allowing them to unfold naturally, just as I had learned to do with myself. The afternoon passed in a quiet haze, with Ethan and me talking here and there, but mostly just being together like we used to. When it was time to leave, Ethan gave me a hug, a little awkward but sincere. "I'll see you soon, Grandma," he said, a smile creeping across his face. I kissed his cheek and watched as he walked toward the car, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. I had no idea what the future held, no idea how long it would take for things to heal completely, but I knew one thing. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid to love, to forgive, or to let go. I wasn't afraid to move forward, because I had finally learned that healing didn't mean going back. It meant accepting the past for what it was, and allowing yourself to move into the future with the strength you had gained along the way. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.